Our author today, Alexandra Horowitz, will be signing festival purchase copies of her book in Telfair Square immediately after this presentation. If you're planning to stay for the next presentation, we just ask you to move forward. Please take a moment to turn off your cell phones. Please make sure that they're on silent. Please know that in this venue, there is absolutely no water at all. I'm sure the ushers told you that. Not even a sip. If we see the sip, we're going to have to ask you to leave. Please respect the church's wishes. And there's no flash photography. Later as you exit, you'll see the buckets on your way out, as Deb explained. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions of Alexandra at the end of her speech today. And we thank Nancy and Carlton Sheets, as well as Beth and Cliff Frone, as sponsors of our remarkable author today. Alexandra Horowitz observes dogs for a living. Her research began over 2 decades ago studying dogs at play and continues today at her dog's cognition lab at Barnard College. She is the author of Inside of a Dog, What Dog Sees, Smell and Know, and 3 other books on looking, being a dog, our dogs, ourselves. She lives with her family of Homo sapiens, Canis familiaris, and Felis catus in New York City. Please help me give a warm Savannah welcome to Alexandra Horowitz.
What a treat. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for Savannah for having me back again. This is what more welcome than that? This is our second time here. I think I came in 2017 after publication of Being a Dog, and I'm just delighted to see everyone's friendly face again. Just curious, with a show of hands, how many people here have pictures of dogs on their phone? Okay. Now, by a show of phones, how many people have a picture of dog as the home screen on your phone? There you go. Okay, and how many of those have a picture of dogs even though they have children? Okay, these are my people. These are my people. All right, so dogs are so significant in our lives, and I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I came to observe dogs for a living. I have a dog cognition lab, as Karen said, in New York City at Barnard College, and that means I study dog behavior. Owned dogs come into our little lab space, and we give them games to play, and we see what they do, we analyze their behavior, and then we make little inferences about what they know or understand based on that. And that was a profession, being a dog cognition researcher, that did not exist 25 years ago when I began to study dogs, but now I'm glad to say there are at least a dozen dog cognition labs in the States, many more internationally, and it's seen as a legitimate scientific inquiry. I'm happy to say, the question of what dogs really know, as opposed to just imagining, which we absolutely do, and assuming which we absolutely do, what dogs know. I've written 4 other books, 3 of which are on dogs. The first one was Inside of a Dog, What Dogs See, Smell, and Know, from that line by Groucho Marx. Outside of a dog, a book is man's best friend. Inside of a dog, it's too dark to read. So I thought I would clarify the inside of a dog, and it's really about this early burgeoning science of dog cognition that was published in 2009. And my whole interest is really that. What is it like to be a dog? What's the dog's perspective? They seem to so agreeably accompany us through our whole lives, but what is their take on it, right? And can I use science to try to understand their take? So that's been my whole approach. That's what I take through these books. My most recent book, The Year of the Puppy, means that, amazingly, my line of work means that adopting a puppy comes as like a research task. And that's what we did for this last book. We actually adopted a puppy and raised her for the first year with me as constantly observing every one of her moments, taking notes on everything she did, while she grew from like a little sploot into, a member of our household. We did not need a puppy. It's a question whether anybody needs a puppy, although they look adorable. I remember my veterinarian friend telling me when I said I was going to adopt a puppy and observe their behavior for a year for a book, she said, "That's a terrible idea. Why would anybody get a puppy?" And the reason she said that only kind of I came to understand it only several weeks into living with a puppy, when I hadn't slept for several weeks, when the house was turned upside down, the relationships between me, my son, my husband, the two dogs we lived with, Finnegan and Upton, and the cat had all been thrown into disarray. Um, I'm glad to say over the course of the year, I think I kind of proved her wrong, but we're not in a rush to get another. We also didn't need a puppy because we were living with two large dogs, Finnegan and Upton, who we'd lived with for, at that point, they were both 12 years old, completely agreeable, lovely, charming Finnegan, who would do anything. It was always my experimental dog, would follow me on any television shoot, would come to the lab and show other dogs how to do the task. And Upton, who was a big, brindle, goofy plot hound mix, they were enough dog for our family, right? And furthermore, though, even though I knew the puppy would kind of disrupt their lives, I also felt some kind of mournfulness about living with Finnegan and Upton, and that was that we did not adopt them as young puppies. I think this is the experience of many people who adopt dogs, especially if you're adopting a dog from a shelter. You meet them months, or in the case of Upton, we met him 3.5 years into his life. And we often would look at him and the things that he would do and wonder, what happened to him? What was his story? What was his early life like? And how did that shape his fear of car doors, or Finnegan's particular attraction to other types of dogs? Where did that come from? And so I figured that by adopting a puppy and seeing her from day one, I could start to understand a dog in the way I'd never understood a dog. So I didn't adopt the puppy at day one. What I did was I found these wonderful people who will foster pregnant moms who were found on the streets and then foster their however many puppies through the first 8 or 10 weeks of their development. And this woman was in upstate New York, a woman named Amy, and she fostered a cattle dog mix named Maze, who was very pregnant with what it turned out to be 11 puppies. And then she fostered those puppies through about week 8 or 8.5 when they were adopted out and scattered into the wind. I came and observed them every week, sometimes twice a week, and I take notes on all their behavior. And so I'm hoping this book helps people who are meeting a puppy at 8 weeks, maybe, which is when you often buy or adopt a puppy, to sort of unpack what's happened in the dog mind and their body for every week up till then. And then, similarly, for every week after that, because they're still developing. I know that many people are going to get this book when they have a puppy in their hand, but it's definitely not a training guide in any way. I am not a trainer. I don't actually do a lot of training with my dogs, and I don't even think a lot of training is that necessary. Training is sort of miscast. It should be teaching. Some kind of teaching is necessary, but not a lot of formal teaching is absolutely necessary. And so nobody should come to my book as a training guide, but it instead is about, well, who is that puppy when they're just born and they're deaf and blind and only can orient themselves by smell and can't even lift up their head? And how do they get to that first week when their eyes open and their ears start to open and they can just lift up their head and start to head towards something warm? Or the third week where they start to notice other puppies around them and follow them and learn from each other as much as they're learning from their mom? How does that develop the little personality that we get so interested in and attracted to, who lives with us and is on all of your phones? That's what I hope that the book will do. It's also a little bit of a scientific memoir. So I'm not only going through the science of early dog development, but I'm also talking about our families and my experience in particular of adopting an 8-week-old, seeing how it disrupts the house and what happens over the course of that year. So, the struggle is real. It's a real struggle. There were disrupted weeks of sleep and things torn and rendered asunder, and dogs running off and not being cooperative. And it's hard. And I hope that people who enter this thinking, oh, dogs are so easy, I'm just going to get a new puppy, and then find themselves 3 days later, which is when I usually hear from people, 3 days after they get a puppy, I think I made a mistake. I hope that they look at this book and see, like, all right, it's a process, and we're going to get through this process. I also, for the book, followed a couple of other litters, including a litter of working dog puppies, which was being raised at the University of Pennsylvania Working Dog Center, because I wanted to see how their week by week developed them into the eventually search and rescue dogs, diabetes detection dogs, cancer detection dogs, which they will become. How did it diverge, and how is it similar to the dog who's going to become a companion dog? So I followed them as well, and I also followed some wolves. I hope to follow wolf puppies. I did witness a wolf artificial insemination, and that I also discuss in the book, and the differences between wolf early development and puppy development, and the differences also, since I've had a child and know a lot about child development and puppy development. Spoiler, the puppies grow up a lot faster. And two, since you're all so agreeable and smiling so nicely, I thought I'd share a couple of what I think of as the key takeaways from the book. And there are 5 that I want to discuss. The first one is your dog is your mirror. Now, there is research that shows that dogs look like their people. You might notice that, right? You sometimes see a dog and a person, and you're like, they are perfectly matched. And in fact, there is a way in which we look like our dogs, and not because we have the same hairstyle, but more just something about the general sensibilities. And the research in the US, in Japan, and lots of countries in between has given people an array of photos of dogs, an array of photos of people, and subjects are able to match at rates better than chance the dog to the person. So we really do look like our dogs in some ways, and it's not clear if you find a dog that looks like you or if we just like grow together over time. I think it's the latter. But they're also a mirror of us in other ways. They're kind of a mirror of us in our behavior, because their behavior shows us how we have dealt with them in the past. Dogs, if they bark to ask to go out, or if they start nibbling you to get your attention, you have actually trained that, even if you don't think you have. Dogs come into human homes not knowing the language, not knowing how things run, not knowing how to communicate with us, but they're really good observers of our behavior. And they're trying to communicate with us. So the ways that they start talking to us are the ways that you respond to. If you ignore your dog all the time when they're nice and quiet, but then start looking out to see what's happening when they bark, they learn. Bark to get your attention. So in that way, they kind of reflect us and how we've been dealing with them, right? So take a look at your dog and you'll see something about yourself. Point 2, for a puppy really, especially, there's no such thing as misbehavior. You pick up any training book and they're going to be talking almost right away about your dog's misbehavior and how to fix it. I think it's miscast misbehavior. Misbehavior is really just communication. It's information gathering. It's enthusiasm. It's excitement. It can even be boredom. So for instance, it's communication. A dog who's barking at a guest. I also say that can be really rude, right? But there's also a way in which it's not rude. It's just telling me something. Someone new, someone's here, someone's made a noise. And I kind of encourage it by going right to the door to see who's there that they've just been telling me about. And I'm also barking back at them in my own way, right? Quiddity, you don't need to bark. Quiddity, stop it. We're in conversation. We're actually having a conversation. That kind of misbehavior should be recast as like, look, they're trying to tell me something and they have succeeded. In fact, we should remember that wolves, from whom dogs are descended, rarely bark at all. They're not barkers. Dogs have evolved to bark as a communication with us. So we might listen. Another thing they do, which is a misbehavior, is maybe sniffing you too closely, right? Lots of people don't like when a dog gets all up in your business and is sniffing you. It's not really impolite from my point of view because dogs see the world through their noses. When we open our eyes in the morning and the world appears to us visually, that's our world. The dog wakes up and opens their nose and smells the world. So up close, they're really just looking at you. They're finding out about you. Their noses actually have the acuity to tell where you've been, what you've eaten. And as you probably know, they can also tell if you've pet any dogs when you were out without them, right? So that's what they're finding out. It's not rude, it's just seeing where you've been, asking about your day. We tend to define dogs' misbehavior basically as those things they do that we don't like, regardless of whether the dog is equipped to understand or appreciate the rules that they're breaking. So your dog's misbehavior, in my mind, is telling you one thing, and it's not that they're a bad dog. It's that they experience the world differently than we do. Point 3, your puppy is probably a teenager. So if you have a dog that's between 6 months and 2 years old, you don't, as commonly assumed, have a puppy. We sort of think they go from puppy straight into being adults, being grown up. But you, my friend, have a teenager. You have an adolescent in like a mature, essentially 30-year-old body. Just like the human teenager might sometimes be erratic in their behavior, distant or argumentative at one moment, and then like really sweet the next moment, teenage dogs can be disobedient, seeming to like seek conflict with you, and then also be really clingy and stick by your side. And this phase in dogs, like in humans and like in all other mammals that go through adolescence, is driven by hormones. So the same hormones that lead to sexual maturity lead to increased sensitivity to touch, being unwilling to be touched maybe, less self-control. And their brains are kind of being rewired at this age. So they're not as good at regulating emotions, and they're not as good at making judgments. So this is when you might see what you think of as challenges to your authority. They might still sit when you ask them to sit, but only if someone else asks them, not you, right? That's classic teenage. But if an adolescent, this matters because if an adolescent dog refuses to come when called, we tend to say that's a bad dog. They've forgotten everything they've learned. What we really should be saying is they're going through a phase. And this especially matters because this age, 6 months to 2 years, is when people tend to relinquish dogs that they've adopted or bought because they think they're bad dogs. Something's happened, I train them, they're untrained, they're chaos, right? And relinquishments often lead to euthanizations. Instead, we should just realize it's a phase, they'll get through it. And it's hard for them too. It's actually been likened by a brilliant dog trainer as like waking up in a tent in a hurricane. So I think if we release our vice grip that they have to be obedient all the time during that time, you can start to appreciate this kind of mischievous scamp that you have. 4, dogs are not given a guidebook to living with humans. So if you're a new owner, especially the first time owner, you might pick up a training book to kind of learn about what new pups are about. That's understandable. But where is the pups book for learning about us? It turns out we are that book. That's a surprise to most people who don't think that we're actually playing the role of having to instruct dogs about the world, but we do. They're not born understanding the Byzantine rules of human social interactions, the rules of our house. They're not born understanding pronouns we put on something. This is my bed, that's your bed. That's not meaningful to them. That's a shoe, that's a chew toy. That's not meaningful to them. We view them as if they understand human society, even though science has showed that they absolutely are understanding something else. So research in my lab showed that guilty look of dogs, you know, the look where, yes, people are nodding, their ears are back, their heads are down, and they clearly look like they've done something wrong. There's a whole world of dog shaming photos out there on the web of dogs who look guilty for some misdemeanor, chewing up the insides of the couch, getting into the trash, eating the turkey that was on the counter. Our lab found that guilty look doesn't come up most often when they've actually done something wrong. It comes up most often when they see their person and they think they're going to be scolded. It's actually a look of appeasement, a submissive behavior to prevent them from getting punished. And it's a pretty cute look, so it often does prevent them from getting punished, right? That's what they've learned. We think they know the rules of human society, but we've actually taught them, here's the look you need to put on to not get punished. So we're not great at writing guidebooks for dogs. So we're not creating an environment so that they can succeed, for instance. You know, you don't leave young kids alone with sharp objects. And you shouldn't leave your dog alone with shrimp platters, for instance, right? If you leave your shoes in the middle of the living room when you've left the house and they have nothing else to do, you've left a really great you-smelling enrichment toy, right? And we should expect that they're going to engage with it in a way you might find objectionable. So I think we have to sharpen up our guidebook skills because we're leading our dogs into this new world. So 5th takeaway from Year of the Puppy: the lower your expectations, the higher your chances of a successful relationship with your pup. And I'm not saying you should have no standards at all, right? That anything goes. But the expectations we tend to have when we adopt a new dog and add them to our lives often get in the way of actually learning who they are. And we have a lot of expectations, right? In today's culture, puppies come to us by the breeder or by a shelter with like a reputation of their breed or a description of who they are already attached. This is a friendly breed. This is one that's good with kids, right? This is one that's trainable. And at the same time, we also look outside and we see people cooperatively walking with their dogs, trotting alongside them, right? Or dogs who are coming when called. And we think it's going to go that way right away. They're going to be friendly, good with kids, and walk by our sides immediately. We think they'll sleep through the night. We think they'll understand us. We think they'll want what we want. We're wrong, of course, right? And it's those expectations that actually just get in the way of us seeing this delightful, difficult, burgeoning personality that's right in front of us. And it's that personality that people love in the end. We were just discussing this. All those things that they do that make them quirky and difficult when you meet them, those are the things I hear about 2 years later as traits of your great dog. We love them because of those faults. So start out that relationship starting to see those and seeing their personality and who they are. They're coming who they are right before your eyes. Okay, that's it. I would love to hear questions about your dogs and tell you about what I learned about the first year of puppies' lives. Yes? I think there's a mic. Is there a mic? Yeah, there's one. There's a question right there. We're making you run. Right behind you. Thank you.
Are all breeds of dogs inherently good?
Are all
But
breeds?
are all breeds of dogs inherently good? Or are there breeds that can be bred, that can be trained to be bad?
Oh, bad dogs? Well, in my view, there are no bad dogs.
That's my feeling too. There's
Yeah.
no bad dogs, but there are people
No.
who will train dogs to be bad.
Oh, but that's different than breeding, right? You could train a dog to behave in ways which are, you can train a dog to be aggressive, right? But there is no breed which is naturally aggressive. And there's been really great science on this now looking at, it's not just my opinion, right? There's great science looking at, since we've mapped the dog genome, looking at individual dog genomes of different breeds and looking at the behavior. And there's no matchup between who the breed is in terms of their genome and more aggressive dogs. The only thing that's really differs between breeds is degree of trainability, with like some herding dogs being more trainable than most other breeds, which itself is not always a good thing, right? If you have a border collie, you know, like they need a lot of things going on all day, right? Like they need the work, right? They'll listen to you if you give them work, but they need it. But there's no bad, I would say aggressive is usually the worst, what we think of as bad dogs. There's no bad breed. Absolutely not. Yes, right in front.
Is that Quid on the cover of your book?
It is Quiddity on the cover of the book. I didn't think she was ready for her star turn. Quiddity is our puppy, who's now 3 years old. And she was a pandemic dog. So we got her. I planned the book in 2019, and I was viewing litters in early 2020. And then suddenly the world changed, and I realized, oh, I'm not going to be able to go visit someone's house pretty soon. We're going to have to adopt one of these dogs. And Quiddity was the dog. I won't, if you're going to read the book, there's like a tiny bit of suspense about which dog it's going to be. But yes, and then when we published the book, she modeled as the cover dog.
Okay, so here's my real question. You're a scientist.
Yeah.
And presumably in academia, you write scientific papers.
Yes.
And yet the books that you write are so accessible to a layperson who like doesn't understand science
Right.
at all, but like I get it when you're talking to a layperson. Can you tell us a little bit about your writing training, your training as a writer?
Yeah.
And how you switch from academia to layperson writing?
Sure. It's such a nice question. Thank you. Well, actually, academic writing I find to be really fun. It's just a style of writing. I almost view it like, now I'm writing mysteries, but for like the 7 people who are going to read this academic journal paper, right? Like, and it is kind of steeped in mystery because you have a hypothesis, you have to look at the backgrounds of the research, you talk about your methodology, then you get results and you analyze your results. It's like unfolding as you go. I love that way of writing also. It has its own jargon, right? And actually more than having to learn to be a writer of popular general nonfiction, I had to learn to be a writer of academic prose because it's a very specific style, almost ridiculous style that you have to talk in order to communicate with other academics. And I don't think I actually had any specific training as a writer, but I was always around books, right? I'm like you all. The more I read, the more I understood how stories go. And then I did have a couple of jobs after college, which put me even more in the sort of center of publishing. One was a job as a dictionary definer at Merriam-Webster. So I was literally defining words. It's hard to believe, given my English grades in high school, that they allowed me to do that. But I was and for that, you do a lot of reading, trying to understand words use in context. And I went from there to work at the New Yorker magazine as a fact checker. And so there too, I was reading lots of great authors' works, some authors of which are here today and are now my friends. And I would be fact checking. So I was very interested in the integrity of the truth while telling a good story. And really my mentor in this respect was Oliver Sacks, who now everybody knows Oliver Sacks, which is fantastic because even though he's passed, his books are just masterful. And what I really loved is he was a scientist, but he also had a background and interest in philosophy and the questions that interest anyone who studies the mind, which are sort of like, what is the mind? Not just when the amygdala goes wrong, what happens, as a scientist is interested in, but why are we saying that the amygdala is an important part of the mind? Why do we even think the mind is here? We used to think the mind was here or here, right? And so he takes all of that and he also writes about it, people's stories and cases in a conversational way. And in many ways, I read him a lot and worked with him before I went to graduate school. He was inspiration for going to graduate school, which I did in cognitive science. And writing just fell out of it naturally. I really felt when I wrote my first book that all the dog cognition research, which was burgeoning, it had changed, and including my own research, had changed the way I dealt with my dogs. And I wanted to share that with other people and share that in a way that was conversational. So I don't think I had any training, but in retrospect, I was prepped for it. So there's a question in the back and then in front. Yeah.
In your research, what is the most important thing we can do as humans to be connected and bonded with these weird animals we bring into our homes?
Yeah. Well, I love that you call them weird animals because I think that's one of the first steps is to realize that they really, even though they're so cooperative and agreeably join us on the couch, eating ice cream and watching television, it's bizarro that they do, right? They're really, really different from us. Their evolutionary history is really, really different. We would never invite a wolf to join us on the, unless you want to lose the couch and the ice cream and maybe, it's a little bit of your hand as well. So I think thinking of them, just trying to remember how alien their world is from ours, even though domestication has changed them enough over time that they can be and are sensitive to humans' cues. They look at our faces, they're very cooperative, they're not nearly as aggressive as a wild animal. Even though they've done that, to see them as alien is important, I think. And the way that I focus on a lot is to remember that they're in an olfactory smell world and try to imagine that most vividly. So everything we do with dogs is visual and auditory because we see and hear, right? Like we think, I know I'm here because I'm looking out at you, you're looking at me, and we feel like we're sharing that moment because of sharing gaze, for instance. Dogs will look at us in the face, but I try to remember that they're smelling what's happening in the moment, and smell doesn't travel at the same speed as light does. So my dog sitting up here next to me wouldn't be seeing the same scene, right? She might be seeing like who was up here before me because they've left their smell. We're sloughing our smell all the time. She might be smelling like the breeze coming in through any smells on the breeze coming in through the door when it's open. She might be smelling anyone who actually just ate something, right? And is smells of that, right? But she's not smelling the same scene. So remembering that they're in a smell-filled universe, I think is really important, and then that changes everything about how I deal with my dogs. I give them find it games at home. I let them smell me closely. We go for a walk. I take sniff walks where it's not about making good time or getting anywhere far or giving them lots and lots of exercise, but some walks are just about letting them sniff whatever they want to sniff, as long as they don't eat it. For as long as they want, because that's them looking out at the world, seeing who was there before, seeing who just came by, like finding out things. So I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind. Thanks for your question.
So we have a Finnegan, and he's a little mouthy.
Yeah.
And I know that's associated with excitement and frustration. I grew up with dogs. I've never had one that's done this before. One of the things that you said was we perpetuate or we cause them to do or we encourage them to do that without realizing that. So what am I doing? We're correcting him. No bite, no screaming, no yelling. No, we don't do that. And he knows, and he's gotten better, but what are we doing that's causing that?
Well, so one of the things, that's a great question. First of all, I will say, being mouthy is a normal dog behavior, right? We don't all have hands. So one of the ways they investigate the world is with their mouth. Now, we define that as something. We think of it as biting or eating. That's not what it is for dogs. It's seeing about things. It's part of play. It's smelling, because if there's an organ above the roof of their mouth called the vomeronasal organ that allows them to smell hormones. So they have to touch something to smell it, to play, to see what it is. And so that happens naturally, and it's a question of like making sure it doesn't cross a line. So first, I think that's important to realize. Second, what might you be doing? Well, I think the tough part with any behavior you don't like is that when we bring attention to the dog, when they do the behavior, we have given them something that they want, right? So just by, talking to them, even negative attention is often better for them than no attention at all. So you've brought yourself into the engagement, and they're like, okay, if I want a little attention, I'm just going to come up and start to nibble her, something like that. So I think the way to sort of eventually extinguish it, and it sounds like it is sort of going away over time, and that might on its own, is to, when something like this happens, and I'm imagining something like she comes up and starts nibbling somebody, is they just move away. They don't give attention. You don't correct them. The best thing you could do is have something else there that immediately goes in their mouth, a rope toy or something like that, instead of your hand. But then the thing they really want the attention from, leave the scene. you don't give them attention at all. And eventually, the behavior will disappear. Good luck.
Thank you.
Following up on your question that dogs see the world through their nose, can dogs smell when you're angry or scared or nervous?
Can you stand up? Because I just can't see. Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Can dogs smell when they're angry or scared?
No, when you are angry and scared.
Yes, yes, there has been research that shows that dogs essentially smell fear, right? Probably through the hormones that we emit when we're scared. We emit cortisol, for instance, which is a stress hormone. Certainly, it's within the realm of their olfactory ability, and that's, again, through the vomeronasal organ, not through their snouts, but through that organ above the roof of their mouth to smell cortisol. That, combined with the fact that anyone who comes at them is scared, will also be giving them a lot of body language, which tells them that they're scared. Dogs are on it right like this. I mean, a lot of people say, well, I don't understand how dogs are distinguishing between people. Like, we smell who we are and we show ourselves through every movement that we do. They are like anthropologists, right? Just studying humans all the time with a special smell sense, and also able to smell the difference between, delight and stress. So yes, there is a very legitimate scientific way in which they smell fear. That doesn't mean they're going to attack you, right? Either they're just noticing it, right? And they'll act on it differently. Yes, right here.
Hi there. My experience of living with the dogs in my life is that they love routine, and they love, you can almost see them starting a new routine. Like, okay, they did that yesterday, now they want to do that particular thing. What about as the dog ages and their brain plasticity? Have there been studies done, can you teach an older dog new behaviors?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, dogs do love routine, and they also it's interesting and sort of paradoxical, they also like new things. So they like the combination, maybe a little bit like us in that way, right? Where we like knowing where our food is coming from, but then we're really, able to go out to a new place or meet a new person as long as we know we're getting a meal, that kind of thing, right? They also are the same. That doesn't change into dotage, into their aging. In fact, and I think something that sometimes people think is that they don't want to see anything new when they're older, right? That they're not learning anything and they're not open to new things, but they really are. What happens is their world shuts down a little bit. It closes down, and a lot of their normal routines they're not able to do anymore. Maybe you have an older dog and they can't do their walk, right? But they've always really loved sniffing. So instead, you might have walks which are just going outside and sitting and letting them sniff for a long time. In a way, that's new, but it becomes a new routine, and it focuses on the thing that the dog already loved to do. There has been not a ton of research into older cognitive deterioration in older dogs, but there is starting to be some. There's a very big project now that looks at older dog behavior. It's actually a citizen science project, and anybody can participate in it if they want to give information about their dogs. But we do know that they have cognitive decline that's very parallel in some sense to what some humans experience over time. They have trouble with forming new memories often, right? They might forget things that they used to know. They might forget how to do some routines. So that's real, but it's just starting to be discovered and researched.
Just a quick question. Do dogs have a sense of time?
Oh, great question.
I'm fascinated.
What do you
by
think? Yeah. Yeah. So I think they do in several ways. One is that, every cell of our body has a circadian rhythm and in some sense has a sense of time. That's how our bodies work. All animals have cells that have a circadian, that keep a circadian time, that know day and night, the passage of time, when you're hungry, things like that. So there's some kind of implicit, unconscious understanding there. But I think that through their sense of smell, they also have an interesting sense of time. So for instance, a lot of people wonder if their dogs, know how long they're gone, right? Distinguish between 5 minutes and an hour and 5 hours gone from the house. There's actually research that shows that they do notice those differences, and the researchers who I love looked at the enthusiasm of the greeting, which was even bigger and bigger and the longer you're gone, even though they got a really big greeting when the people were only gone for 5 minutes. I think that they can tell this time distance through noticing changes in smell. Because every room to them has a smell, and smells change over the course of the day. For instance, your home smells like you and your dogs. I'm sorry, even if you're super clean, it smells like you and your dogs to some level, and a new person who comes into the house might detect that, right? But that smell actually deteriorates a little over time because odors are just volatile molecules in the air, and they fall to the ground over time. So for a dog, every day, if you're leaving the house going to work, the house is you smelling, and you leave, and it just gets less and less and less as the day progresses. By the time you come back, bringing a big odor of you and you actually into the house, the smell is deteriorated. So they notice the passage of day through the smell of you. There was, I had this hypothesis that this is how dogs note time. And there was a nature show, I think on the BBC, which wanted to test it. So they found a dog who was let me think, wasn't a Weimaraner, but it was, anyway, it was a single dog who always seemed to be able to tell when his person was coming home. And there were no other cues. There was no car driving up the gravel driveway. It wasn't always exactly the same time of day, but right before it came home, they seemed to dog always moved to the door. And I thought, well, maybe it's because they're gone more or less the same amount of time every day, and they're noticing this diminishment in his odor over day. So the guy went to the gym in the middle of the day, wore a t-shirt, got it all sweaty, and the BBC snuck it into the house when the dog wasn't noticing. The guy was still at work. So suddenly, here's a big infusion of the dog's person's smell in the middle of the day. What happened when the person arrived home? The dog didn't anticipate that he was coming home. In other words, he thought it's only been a couple hours because it still smells of him. So I think smell gives them a sense of time passing. One more question. Yep, right here.
What is your opinion of spaying and neutering and the effect on behavior?
Spaying, neutering is like a big question. It, of course, affects behavior, but not always in the way that we think. And the research so again, what does a spay and neuter do? It gets rid of the gonads of the male or female. These have the sex hormones. These are hormones that also do a lot of other things, right? These are hormones that are involved in memory formation, bone growth, muscle growth, right there. And this is why we don't spay and neuter ourselves. Like these are important hormones. So when you get rid of those hormones, there can be changes in behavior and body as a result of that. We think, it used to be thought, that for instance, if you neutered a dog, he becomes less aggressive. The research on that shows that 2/3 of the time, a male dog will become slightly more aggressive. You know, and I'm saying aggressive in quotes because lots of things are defined as aggressive behavior. Sometimes female dogs, when spayed, get a slightly more aggressive, for instance. Some dogs get more affection seeking, are a little less energetic after being spayed and neutered. So there are behavior changes, but they're different for different breeds, and they're not consistent over time. And they're definitely not what we think they're going to be, right? That you're going to go from having like a wild animal to sort of like a tacit, cooperative animal, right? That's just something that comes with forming a relationship over time. Thank you all. I'll be signing books and you can ask questions and show me the picture of your dog. Thanks for coming.